Hello, and welcome back to Rehydrate. This season, we discussed the original Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov. This is a special episode where we have a special guest, Joel, from the Seldon Crisis podcast on. My name is Dan, and I have now read the entire series, and I read Foundation's Edge after the series because I was so interested to read it that I continued.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, welcome, Joel. We really like your podcast, The Seldon Crisis. I'm excited to have you here on Rehydrate. My name is Thalia. I have now read all of the Foundation trilogy and have experienced a few of Isaac Asimov's short stories and a few of his novels since I picked up an anthology, and that's usually where his science fiction is all strung together.
My name is Priya, and I have read the entire trilogy now, and I've also watched the entire first season of the show. And the only other book I've read by Isaac Asimov is I, Robot. And it's lovely to have you on the show, Joel.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I've really enjoyed your podcast. I've listened to, 4 or 5 of them, of the episodes. And I love the analysis you do, and you guys get really deep into it. So it's a little different than mine. You get a lot deeper into a lot of the analysis than I do. I just have fun telling the stories. But I have been a big fan of Asimov since I was a teenager. I grew up with the big three, Asimov, Clarke, and Heinlein. And Asimov was always my first and, my most dear of the three of them. And I just, I read Foundation as a kid, and I just got back to it during the pandemic. In the summer of 2020, I read the 2 sequels and 2 prequels. And when I was done with it, I just couldn't let go. It was so much in me. I turned my son onto it and had him read all 7 of them. He loved them. So that was great. We talked about it for a while, and then I thought, no, I want to talk to more people about this. So why don't I do a podcast? So that's how it started.
Well, the format for this show is going to be a little bit different than we've tried before. I've heard a lot of podcasts that have done draft style, so I thought there'd be a good experiment for us to try. So what I proposed, and everyone agreed to, was we do a draft of Asimov quotes from Foundation. And so the premise is that we just kind of go through the books and the first 3 books. I know some of us have read other ones. But for the first 3 books, to kind of just pick out quotes or sections that we really like, and we'll kind of talk about them a little bit, about why we like them, and then just read the quotes. So it's going to be a snake order draft, meaning the first pick for the first round goes last the second round. So the order that we're going to go in is Joel's going to go first, followed by Thalia, then Priya, and then me. And then so for the second round, it'll be me, and then Priya, and then Thalia, and then Joel. And we're going to do 3 rounds. So let's start, and let's go with Joel's first quote.
Okay, so this goes back to the first novel and the last chapter in it, The Merchant Princes. And this is about halfway through that story. It's a pretty long story, as you might recall. But about halfway through the story, after Mallow had arrived on Corel and he had met the Commodore, there is a scene where he goes into a factory and shows off a bunch of the Foundation's nifty gadgets. They cut things and, impress the Commodore and all the people there. And, it's basically Mallow just standing up giving this big sales demo. And right near the end of it, there's a really interesting quote that I'm going to read off right now. The Commodore's own bodyguards, in the confusion, had struggled to the front line, and Mallow, for the first time, was near enough to see their unfamiliar hand weapons in detail. They were nuclear. There was no mistaking it. An explosive projectile weapon with a barrel like that was impossible. But that wasn't the big point. That wasn't the point at all. The butts of those weapons had, deeply etched upon them, in worn gold plating, the spaceship and sun. The same spaceship and sun that was stamped on every one of the great volumes of the original encyclopedia that the Foundation had begun and not yet finished. The same spaceship and sun that had blazoned the banner of the Galactic Empire through millennia. This really resonated with me because one of the main things that I think entranced me about this story from the very beginning from the beginning with Seldon's predictions and the whole setting of it was just the awe-inspiring scope in space and time, that this was so far in the future. And 30,000 years is just an amazing amount of time to consider in the first place. And it involved the entire galaxy. And this is emblematic of that, because there's the time that's passed since they've last heard of the Foundation, last interacted with the Foundation, and you have the distance to the center of the galaxy, and it's all represented in this sudden revelation that things have kind of come full circle again. And there is the Empire. It's still there. That's why I liked it.
Yeah, for sure. I love the scope and like you said, the history, like the time expansion, right? Like they go into that for like the even like the whole series, and like you talk about like historical stuff that's like the future for us, right? Like the fall of the empire and that kind of stuff. Yeah, I love just the scope of the series and everything about the universe. It drew me into when I first read it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go with the number 2 pick with Thalia.
Thank you. Very difficult to follow you, Joel. As Barr says to Mallow, although I know it's out of fashion in these decaying times to be a scholar, nevertheless, the intrepid hosts of Rehydrate have gathered some quotes for our intellectual nourishment. So I approached my first quote by focusing on a character that I really enjoyed, and that would be the psychologist of Ebbling Miss, who in his final days, when he's being impelled to work to himself to death or exhaust his mental faculties, or however you view the prism of his last moments, and there's this arrogance to his pronouncement when he's speaking about how problems are absent and everything flows through him, and the revelation of the twist that this is not his own, sheer brilliance, but in fact he's being controlled and working on behalf, working for a force outside of himself. That's a twist, but I think it's hidden really well because it does suit the personality of Ebbling Miss that we've grown to know. So I chose the opening lines from The Psychologist, his introduction, chapter 15. If you're following along at home, that's in Foundation and Empire, in the second section, The Mule. There was reason to the fact that the element known as pure science was the freest form of life on the Foundation. In a galaxy where the predominance and even survival of the Foundation still rested upon the superiority of its technology, even despite its large access of physical power in the last century and a half, a certain immunity adhered to the scientist. He was needed, and he knew it. Likewise, there was reason to the fact that Ebbling Miss, only those who did not know him added his titles to his name, was the freest form of life in the pure science of the Foundation. In a world where science was respected, he was the scientist, with capital letters and no smile. He was needed, and he knew it. So I really liked, obviously, the whole arc of Ebbling Miss, and I know that Asimov, in his later years outside of the Foundation series, has written about the strain of anti-intellectualism, and I believe Dan brought it up as a reflection of a trend that he sees in America, but the tension between our political life and our cultural life and scientific life, between ignorance and knowledge and technology and its absence, is, I think, really one of the best themes in the Foundation. So that's why I chose this.
What would Isaac think now if he was still around?
Yeah, wouldn't be good. It's only degenerated since his time, right?
Yeah.
It reminds me also of there's another quote later on. I don't remember the exact quote, when Arcadia is talking to Kalia about Homir, about like his job, how he's a librarian, and she's like, "Oh, he's so important. He's only a librarian." And Arcadia's like, "Librarian's like the most important job that you can have in our society." So yeah, it's interesting how Asimov like elevates like these more professional kind of roles into like high important roles.
Yeah, we need more heroes like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and even Arcadia is like a writer, and like she's a hero of the story. So like all the people who have like the highest intelligence seem to rise to the top in these stories, and that's how it should be. But it's not actually is. Okay, now with the number 3 pick, Priya.
So the quote that I am going to start off with is the quote that Chanis, upon encountering the people of Rossum, says regarding the nature of their feelings around punishment. So he says, "Don't you see that the whole orientation of their domination is different? It is not physical, but psychological. They speak of punishment only of others. It is as if knowledge of punishment has been so well implanted in them that punishment itself need never be used. The proper mental attitudes are so inserted into their minds that I am certain that not a Tazendian soldier exists on the planet. Don't you see all this?" So I've been thinking about this a lot in recent times, and this ties back directly to what Joel was saying just a moment ago about what would Asimov think of what's happening right now. And um I've been thinking of this specifically in light of the war happening between Russia and Ukraine, and how the world has been sort of holding its breath because we're all terrified of nukes, obviously. So I've always had this like really, really deep fear of nuclear warfare. And I think nuclear warfare is this knowledge of punishment that looms over us, like the ultimate punishment, right? And it always has terrified me ever since I was, in my early 20s. I read A Canticle for Leibowitz, and which predicts, nuclear annihilation. And I've always thought, like, this is all sci-fi that predicts our end in nuclear warfare seems the most like plausible to me all the time. Like AI taking over doesn't get me the way that like nukes do. So I always thought like the invention of nukes is probably the worst thing that happened throughout our history. And recently I was listening to an interview with Yuval Noah Harari, which I'm sure all of you know.
Oh, yeah.
And he mentioned that up until now, the nukes have actually fulfilled the function of preventing countless wars that would actually have happened if it weren't for the threat of nuclear warfare. And I think I had never really stopped to consider all the wars that haven't happened because of them, and sort of just fixated on this deep fear that they are going to be our end. And so I think that this description of the psychology of the people of Rossum sort of really applies on a macro level to like the state of all of humanity, in a sense, in a world where we are so advanced that we have this threat of, world annihilation looming over our heads, that threat need actually never be used to actually to keep us in check. And right now is a very difficult time because that all seems to kind of be crumbling, that notion. So I mean, I'll stop with the doom and gloom, but that's why that's one of my favorite quotes.
Wow. Yeah, I just want to say I have felt much the same, and I actually have never read Canticle for Leibowitz, and I know it's a crime I have to solve. I was terrified of nukes as soon as I grew up and realized this insane doctrine, the mad, mutually assured destruction, and was, terrified that this just wasn't going to work. And it's amazing that it has worked this long. But I really don't think much about that aspect of what we've saved by doing that and what wars there would have been. All I think about is how incredibly stupid it would be to lose it all in nuclear annihilation. It just feels like the dumbest utopia or dystopia that possible. AI seems like we could accept, that being a difficult problem to solve and something we shouldn't have expected. But when you have a doctrine that's just, if you annihilate us, we're going to annihilate you and all humanity will be gone, that just seems like a really dumb approach. I hope it never comes to that.
So since this podcast originally started out as a Remembrance of Earth Past podcast, I would be remiss in saying that I would recommend you read that series if you haven't. It's also known as the Three Body Problem series, because there is a big theme of mutually assured destruction there that kind of follows along with that. So if
It's
No, it's
definitely on my
interesting.
list, and a
Yeah,
lot of it is because of how much I've heard you guys talking about it.
we talked
Yeah,
about it a lot.
we can't help but tie it into like literally everything. And I think that Liu Cixin was definitely very much inspired by Asimov in writing this
Absolutely.
series. So
Certainly.
lots of themes come up there.
Okay, well, now it's my turn with the number 4 pick for the first round. So I kind of cheated and took a conversation that kind of spans a chapter, but kind of picked out little parts of it. And it's my favorite part of the whole series, which is the interaction between the mule and Chanis. I just love their interplay between each other, and like they're antagonizing each other, and like Chanis knows that like he has the leg up, and the mule know he has the leg up. I just love it. So I picked out a couple quotes. There's a couple breaks in between them. The Chana starts out with saying, "So he created his foundations according to the laws of psychohistory, but who knew better than he that even those laws were relative? He never created a finished product. Finished products are for decadent minds. His was an evolving mechanism, and the second foundation was the instrument of that evolution. We, first citizen of your temporary union of worlds, we are the guardians of Seldon's plan. Only we." And later on, the mule, when he has the advantage, says, "He felt the walls behind him, and the mule faced him, skinny arms akimbo, lips smiling terribly beneath that mountain of a nose. The mule said, 'Your game is through, Chanis. The game, all of you, all of the men of what used to be the second foundation, used to be, used to be.'" And finally, the mule says, "My ships are launched against Tazenda 12 hours ago, and they are quite through with their mission. Tazenda is laid in ruins. Its centers of populations are wiped out. There was no resistance. The second foundation no longer exists, Chanis. And I, the queer, ugly weakling, am ruler of the galaxy." So I've read and listened to this chapter like multiple times. I just love like the interplay between like the back and forth of like Pritchard and Chanis and the mule and then the mule and the first speaker. I just love it. And especially like how they just antagonize each other here. Especially like the quote that I wanted to bring this whole thing up with was when Chanis says, "We, for a citizen of your temporary unions of worlds." I just love that quote.
Yeah, it's an awesome section. It's funny. The first time I read through Foundation, I felt like no, the second time I should say in 2020 when I read it, I felt that that whole section didn't like hit me that as something felt off about it. It just didn't work for me. But then there's doing the podcast. I have to do what I call close reading, where I read every line and have to understand everything that's going on. I tend to read too fast, and skip over
Same.
things and miss stuff. And that's been the most wonderful thing about doing the podcast is that close reading just makes me feel like I'm really understanding what Asimov is thinking and why he's doing everything. And that section just came alive, and that whole interplay was just brilliant, and I loved it.
Yeah, I think the fact that it all happens in like a single room, and like that room, you can see it in your mind. They talk about the light, just like the single light strand being in the Rossum fashion, just sitting there, and like they're in this cold room. The mule's all bundled up in his coat because it's like a super cold planet, and they're just like battling it out, with their minds.
I talk about this on Seldon Crisis, but there's
Yeah,
the plot structure has this constriction. Everything
yeah,
gets compressed down into this one room and just three people, for most of it, and then a fourth. But it's it just ramps up the tension so powerfully, and it's just brilliantly done.
Okay, well, now we're moving on to round 2. And like I said before, we're using snake case drafting. So I get the first pick of the second round. And looking over all the quotes that I picked, they're all they're all in sort of the same vein. They're two people antagonizing each other. So the second one I'm going to pick is from Second Foundation. It's from the beginning of the second part with Arcadia. And specifically when Anthor is at her window. And Arcadia is, you're introduced to her and like her character, and like it's such a great introduction to like what her character is and how confident she is. And so the scene is that Anthor is at her window, and Arcadia says, "If you jump off, young man, I will personally give the alarm." This was intended as a refined and sophisticated thrust of irony, since to Arcadia's enlightened eyes, the intruder was obviously a mature 30 at least, quite elderly in fact. The man's eyes were wide with chagrin. That was a bluff? How dare you, kid? I consider that a very impertinent question, young man, and I am not accustomed to being addressed as kid. I don't wonder. You're probably the mule's grandmother in disguise. Do you mind if I leave now before you arrange our lynching party with myself as a star performer? So yeah, I guess I just like the parts of the series when people are against each other or like antagonizing each other. And like I said, like I really like the introduction of Arcadia here as like sort of the new heroine of and the main character of the book. And it's just like a refreshing change of perspective from what we've seen throughout the rest of the series, like with just different perspectives with 14-year-old high school girl basically, who is the confident heroine of the story.
I love the bluff about the baseball bat too.
Yeah.
Choice, Dan. I also really like this exchange when she like has him still dangling out the window and she's like, oh, watch out, you're gonna like fall and break your neck in the precious rose bushes. And the
Right.
guy's like, I would have arranged those adjectives differently. So she's punchy and confident and really well chosen. I love that interaction.
Yeah, I'm really glad you picked that, Dan, because I mean, after to follow like the doom and gloom mood that I set up, I've spoken often of how much I love Arcadie's sassiness, and she comes right out with it when we're first introduced to her. So it was very refreshing to me to see a female character presented that way after all my gripes of the female characters presented prior besides Beta. So yeah, it was nice to see someone quippy like that.
Does your quote have similar quippiness, Priya?
Alas, no. But it is on a different theme. We're moving right along from nuclear annihilation to something very different. This is more of almost like a philosophical thing to me. My background is as a once upon a time I was an English major, and so I love language and I love the fact that we are the only animal that can communicate this way in the way that we do, and where our language is in itself a form of art. So this quote from Second Foundation it's always very compelling to me, but very weird because I can't wrap my brain around it. So the quote is, speech originally was the device whereby man learned imperfectly to transmit the thoughts and emotions of his mind. By setting up arbitrary sounds and combinations of sounds to represent certain mental nuances, he developed a method of communication, but one which in its clumsiness and thick-thumbed inadequacy degenerated all the delicacy of the mind into gross and guttural signaling. So this is very compelling because I've never thought of speech as an inadequacy. Speech always stands out to me as a human superpower. But assuming that communication without speech were possible, I can see where this notion would arise from. It's almost like we're not evolved enough. And that's why speech is our best bet at communicating our thoughts and the complexities of our mind. But imagine if you didn't even have to put the complexities of your mind through a medium like speech, and you could just convey it all just in its raw form, which is a really nice idea. But in the real world, I feel like it's a thing that makes humans as unique as we are. So
the real world.
Yeah, the real world, unlike the fake world of Asimov. But who knows?
I don't know.
Maybe one day.
Yeah.
I think this is definitely not the first time I've brought this up, the parallels that I see between Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, and Foundation. But to me, this just always comes through very strongly. Like every single Chinese student would be able to finish the phrase like Dao ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao, Ming ke Ming, Fei Chang Ming. Like the famous line of the Tao Te Ching roughly translates to the path that can be discussed is not the transcendent path. Like the name that can be named is not the eternal name. Like, just by trying to force it into speech patterns or human minds, we ultimately are diminishing it. And I think that
I
you
never
need to
thought of
understand some of those prisms. Yeah.
the second foundation as Taoists. That is so cool.
That's amazing. And there is also something that we talk about in literature and literary analysis is whenever you refer to something as the sublime, it's something that's ineffable. You cannot put it into words. So there is also that. So I can see this idea as being like this beautiful idea where, like, yes, we have speech and we can create all kinds of prose and beautiful, works of art with it. But then there are still some things that are so transcendent. They are the sublime and you cannot put them in words. So it is a very beautiful idea, albeit very weird.
What I think is really interesting, there's an irony with it because we tend to like worship our ability to speak and write and communicate with words, and almost arrogantly it's like, we are the only species that can do this, so therefore this must be a great thing that we have developed, and we don't think of the downside, and why we're so miserable all the time, because we're not like dolphins just leaping through the water enjoying life. We're or dogs running through the field, smelling things. It's almost like this is like a mental degeneration disguised as this great progress or something, the way he describes it. So that's a really interesting thing.
Well, I'm glad that Priya chose a different theme, because I think it leads into my quote. And I believe, if I understand this snake quote draft, I'm up next.
You are next.
Okay. Well, just as the snake curls back on itself, I chose a quote where we're seeing echoes of the past in our characters and in our themes. And even a quote that Priya begged us not to use is going to rear its head. So this is, again, I guess it's a little bit of what Dan brought up as well. There's conflict between two characters, between Seth Cermak and Salvor Hardin. And this is when, I think we've discussed this most in episode 2, the mayors and the traitors, when they are strengthening Anacreon and they have this policy of giving them medical facilities and nuclear power and even fixing their dilapidated ships. And this obviously causes Cermak to bristle, because he is more for isolationism and strength, and tells Hardin he's been playing the fool in a colossal game of blackmail. And the two of them acknowledge like the ghost in the room between them, because this is several centuries in the future, but Seldon's doctrine, violence is the last refuge of the incompetent, is not only present in their minds, it's actually on a plaque in the wall. And so it's in the minds of the Foundation, and Hardin is still affected by it. But his statement, and the quote that I chose, was, "The temptation was great to muster what force we could and put up a fight. It's the easiest way out and the most satisfactory to self-respect, but nearly invariably the stupidest." So whatever you think of the original Seldon plan for building an encyclopedia at the end of the galaxy, everything that Seldon has done and said is still very sticky throughout these centuries. Even though his predictions are usually about forgetting and rebuilding, there's still this presence in the specter of history that looms over all of these conversations that are happening. So I liked when these characters were in conflict, but they're still united by Harry Seldon. They can't seem to get away from it.
Yeah, I love that quote too. It's a great one. I'm going to start with a dialogue actually between Belriose and Dusambar that happens near the end of the first half of the General, when Belriose is wrestling with this idea of what the Foundation stands for and what the Seldon Plan is all about, and just really trying to grapple with how the Foundation can be so idiotic, basically. And he says, "You mean that this art of his predicts that I would attack the Foundation and lose such and such a battle for such and such a reason? You are trying to say that I am a silly robot following a predetermined course into destruction. No, I have already said that the science had nothing to do with individual actions. It is the vaster background that has been foreseen. Then we stand clasped tightly in the forcing hand of the goddess of historical necessity, of psychohistorical necessity. And if I exercise my prerogative of free will, if I choose to attack next year or not to attack at all, how pliable is the goddess? How resourceful? Attack now or never, with a single ship or all the force in the empire, by military force or economic pressure, by candid declaration of war or by treacherous ambush. Do whatever you wish in your fullest exercise of free will. You will still lose. Because of Hari Seldon's dead hand, because of the dead hand of the mathematics of human behavior that can neither be stopped, swerved, nor delayed. Ryosei pauses for a moment, staring into the implacable face of the old patrician, then announces his course. I'll take that challenge. It's a dead hand against a living will. Well, obviously, I found this really fascinating because I think it's a central theme of the whole series is that this dichotomy between psychohistory and free will. That the whole idea of Seldon's plan is that individuals don't matter, that it's that it's all just predetermined, basically, that based on how things are moving sociologically with large groups of people. And Ryosei just has a big problem with that because he thinks he's hot stuff and he's the great man of history. So this refers to a theory called the great man of history, the great man theory of history that came out in the late 19th century. A guy named Carlyle wrote about. And it's kind of an assumption that has been kind of accepted in, to this day by most people, that were it not for people like Gandhi, Napoleon, Caesar, all these major figures, we'd have a very different world. And a classic example of this is when in time travel, they talk about, going back and killing Hitler as a baby and, saving the Holocaust from happening. And according to the sociological side of it, it would still happen that way. It would just be a different Hitler. There'd be some other face, the face of a movement, right? And that these individuals are not that important. And I think it's really interesting if you think, like taking it back to what we talked about earlier with the Ukraine war. There's a lot of people say, well, Putin is the problem. If we got rid of Putin, everything would be rosy. And if this is true, then that's not the case. The problem with Putin is the problem of a sociological phenomenon in Russia, kind of like what happened in the Weimar Republic after World War I in Germany. And, the people were aggrieved and looking, they felt that their sense of the great German, that our destiny is to be strong and powerful, and here we are miserable and weak and pathetic, and something needs to be done about that. And even if it's something desperate, like putting ourselves behind this madman. And I think a very similar pattern is happening in Russia right now. And I have some insight into it because my wife is Russian. So it's been a very powerful time for us to talk about this. And she's pretty seriously affected by it.
I think on top of that, going back to the part of the foundation aspect of it, to me, what made this going back and looking at the story after reading this series even more interesting is the fact that the second foundation is controlling all this stuff. It's not like a dead hand. It's a living thing that the second foundation is always controlling and always adjusting to fit into the plan. So the quote with Dusan sees it as this grand, almost godlike, right? This plan is going to continue no matter what you do, but it's only because the second foundation's out there, adjusting people's minds and controlling the situation to fit into their plan.
But I think there was a pivotal moment in the whole development of the plot of Foundation, right at the end of the General, where it worked the way Dusenbar talked about up until that point. And that's when the mule entered the picture, and the second Foundation entered the picture. And we really don't know when the second Foundation really entered the picture. And getting back to something I talked about before we started, which is it's a shame that Asimov died prematurely when he did, because he had there are rumors that he had planned to write something about the second Foundation that follows in time with the second prequel. So basically contemporaneous with the story as it develops in the psychohistorians and encyclopedists. So the idea would be that the second Foundation was active during those times, or developing some activity, and we don't know how involved they were.
Yeah, I guess like in my headcanon of the series, like they were active ever since the time ever since the time that they're established, right? Like we didn't know about them in the first book, or the first book and the first part of Foundation and Empire, but they were there. Like that's my assumption anyway, that they're always continue, because like they talked about like when they see the Prime Radiant, they have like that red line going across like the entire plan. So like that was my assumption, that they were always adjusting the plan, from the very onset. But part of the plan initially was them to convey the plan as sort of godlike, and people bought into it. The first Foundation bought into it, and considered like, oh, we're going to do whatever we can do. And it seemed like at the end of the Bel Rios chapter that they didn't do anything, but maybe the second Foundation did it, right?
Well, yeah, I did kind of wonder when was it Lathan Devers and Dusenbar got away so easily. Twice after causing a terrible commotion, and they were able to escape, and you wondered if there was the hand of the second Foundation.
Yeah, same with like Beta and Tauren, right? They got away, quote unquote, easily.
In some ways, I fought that. I didn't want the second Foundation to be involved, because I wanted agency in those people, and especially with Beta. I didn't want Beta to be under the power of anyone. I wanted her to be heroic and to be self-directed.
I think she wasn't controlled, though. I think they said they didn't control her.
It's really questionable. It's funny because one of the first guests I had on Seldon Crisis was a philosopher who has a course that he teaches comparing Foundation with Plato's Republic, and he knows it inside and out. And he told me Beta was controlled, and I was really, I didn't think she was controlled. And then I looked for the evidence of it when I read it, and I didn't find anywhere that said she was controlled. And so it's kind of implied, maybe, if you look at it in a certain way, that she was controlled, because we know that the second Foundation was on Trantor, and that's where things were happening. They must have been around, when she was having her ultimate confrontation with Magnifico the Mule.
I seem to remember in Foundation's Edge they talk about her not being controlled, but I can't. I just read it, so like I can't remember exactly, and I kind of sped through it. I wasn't analyzing it, but I seem to remember a section where I talked about Beta and her not being controlled.
I think you're referring to the part where wasn't it the Mule himself who admits that, or implies that, like, because she just liked him for who he was, he never felt the need to control her, because she was amiable and almost like agreeable towards him without having to be controlled. And that was like his fatal flaw, unless, I don't know, there is something else to suggest that that analysis was not accurate.
She wasn't controlled by the Mule for sure, but I think the question is, like, was she controlled by the second Foundation?
By the second Foundation,
Oh,
or
right.
like was she accounted for and adjusted, I guess.
You just reminded me that I have a second quote.
Yeah, so let's go with we're going to start with round number 3 here, and Joel gets the first pick again.
And you gave me the lead in for it, because it's by Beta, and it's after the revelation of the Mule's true identity, and after he tells his pitiful story and says, that he loved her basically, and that was the problem, and that he says at the end of this big long diatribe. He says, in a sense, you have defeated me. And Beta's response is, quote, in a sense, only in a sense, we have defeated you entirely. All your victories outside the Foundation count for nothing, since the galaxy is a barbarian vacuum now. The Foundation itself is only a minor victory, since it wasn't meant to stop your variety of crisis. It's the second Foundation you must beat. The second Foundation. And it's the second Foundation that will defeat you. Your only choice was to locate it and strike before it was prepared. You won't do that now. Every minute from now on, they will be readier for you. At this moment, the machinery may have started. You'll know when it strikes you, and your short term of power will be over, and you'll be just another strutting conqueror flashing quickly and meanly across the bloody face of history. End quote. And I didn't include the part right after that, but it's interesting because she says, and now you're going to kill us, basically, and we're happy to die. Torrin and I are going to get wiped out because you're the mule, you have all this power, you're going to kill us. And so that kind of explains her bluster. She thinks there's nothing to lose, and she's trying to get under his skin and have her revenge, knowing that she's going to die. And then he lets them off and says, "No, I'm not going to kill you."
Out of friendship, or he says out of supposed, or what I consider friendship, or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which it seemed a little odd, but it also there's an odd aspect to this because it seems like misplaced bluster. Like, really, they've defeated him? Not really. It's kind of she's going out on a limb there, but she wants to stick it to him. And the other thing I love about that quote, other than just her triumph and her spirit in that, is it sets up the rest of the trilogy, the final novel, so well. It kind of sets the table for it.
Yeah, and interesting. It seems like in the future history of the series, like Beta does become a hero, because Arcadia writes about her as a heroic figure, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and in a lot of ways that she did, she's known as the conqueror of the mule, and in Arcadia really plays that up in her writing.
Yeah.
And of all the twists and turns, I would say like that one was my favorite one. I think at times they feel rather like, a rapid fire series of plots and twists and turns, but and then I start to like anticipate, well, I'm sure that there will be a plot twist on this plot twist as well. But with that particular one, I really enjoyed the way that panned down, because I remember I had to go back and read the moment right before that where Beta shoots Miss, and I like had to read it again to see if I had actually read that correctly. So yeah, that was one of the more enjoyable moments for me, with her coming out on top in that scene.
It's such a delightful shock. Yeah. And we haven't talked about the TV show. I'm kind of horrified that they're not going to be able to come close to doing what that did. Even though they've had some great twists and turns in the TV show too that I wasn't expecting. But that one, they can't do it the same way. And I'm just afraid it's going to be disappointing.
I agree.
All right. Well, our next pick is Thalia.
For my third and final quote, I think we discussed this a little bit in episode 3, The Merchant Princes, but I'll be diving a little bit more into Hober Mallow and the antagonist, Joran Sut, or Sut, I think we just called them, the secretary to the mayor of the Foundation. I chose this to demonstrate, again, this circular time in Foundation, like something's presented as new and innovative, and then later it's introduced to the characters and the readers that the brand new, radical, controversial ideas that we were just introduced to are now stagnant and useless. And there's this tension about whether you're stubborn and holding on to it or letting it go. I think we see this again when the first speaker's student is pointing to their maybe it's not stated it's a whiteboard. I always pictured it as a whiteboard, but when they're looking at the Seldon plan, he's saying like, no, like, but this shows it's wrong. And it's like, no, no, no. You just are stubbornly holding on to the past. The new radical plan is ever changing. So when we are introduced to Sut speaking to Manlio, he's stating, look, Manlio, we're proceeding along a planned history. We know that Harry Seldon worked out the historical probabilities of the future. We know that someday we're to rebuild the Galactic Empire. We know that it will take 1,000 years or thereabouts. We know that in the interval we will face certain definite crises. Now, the first crisis came 50 years after the establishment of the Foundation, and the second, 30 years later after that. Almost 75 years have gone since then. Any fool can tell a crisis when it arrives. The real service to the state is to detect it in its embryo. And my favorite part of his quote, what's bad for the Foundation, a crisis, is good for traditionalists and good for Sut. So he announces, almost with glee, we're in the middle of a Seldon crisis.
I like that too, because I feel like that's kind of how in the books, like those scenes played out in the vault where Harry Seldon would appear, and it would be almost like like a production, and you just wonder, like, these are all just like pre-recorded like holograms. Is he even going to be relevant? And I think in one of them he like completely miscalculated everything because he hadn't anticipated the mule. But there was like this I guess this almost like this theatrical nature to these presentations that and then the Seldon plan itself, like at one point it's like it's like described as like this immaterial plan just like hanging over everyone's heads and like prompting them into like inaction in many cases. So yeah, I like how that like gets to the heart of that.
And I like the shift that we're seeing in the Foundation from science to religion of science to finally what Sut is trying to protest against, which is the power of trade and economic power. And, you know, resisting that ultimately leads to him being, I think, Hober Mallow as the protagonist. So I can pretty squarely put Sut as the antagonist, but feel free to disagree with that interpretation too.
No, yeah, he's seen as the protagonist of history, right? Like he's the more mythical figure, him and Harden.
What's interesting to me is I'll just paraphrase the quote the other quote that ties into this really closely is at the end of the Merchant Princes. He talks about kind of how he's just he knows he's kind of like almost like a fictional character. He's almost talking as if he's breaking the fourth wall. And saying, like, obviously Seldon has this all planned out. I don't get to really choose anything, but I'm just going to make the most of it. And it kind of he's trapped. It's almost like he realizes, like, Asimov wrote him, and I can't do anything about it. That guy wrote me, and hopefully he puts me in the right place.
Okay, well, the next pick is Priya's, your last quote.
Okay, well, I'm back on with the gloominess, but it's I thought this quote really speaks to like everything, all the themes. So this is from Second Foundation. The quote is, "All the suffering that humanity ever knew can be traced to the one fact that no man in the history of the galaxy until Harry Seldon, and very few men thereafter, could really understand one another. Every human being lived behind an impenetrable wall of choking mist within which no other but he existed. Occasionally, there were the dim signals from deep within the cavern in which another man was located, so that each might grope towards one another. Yet, because they did not know one another and could not understand one another and dared not trust one another and felt from infancy the terrors and insecurity of that ultimate isolation, there was the hunted fear of man for man, the savage rapacity of man toward man." And I mean, doesn't that just like encapsulate everything?
Yeah.
Like everything that we see in our present, in our past, throughout the course of human history. It's just this and I would actually go so far as to say that it wasn't that it was until like I don't think Harry Seldon understood it that well either, because this is talking about like individuals' mistrust of other individuals, and then how that translates to entire societies, countries, feeling divided and not trusting entire masses of other people. Like he could understand this mistrust on the level of the masses, but I think that, you know, he couldn't quite grasp like the anomalies that individuals act out because of these types of mistrusts, like how the mule ended up being this huge anomaly despite being a single human, but it was based off of that same mistrust of all of the rest of humanity. And of course, this is I have to bring in the fact that, like, if you read The Dark Forest by Lucy Shin, this kind of describes that very precisely, that phenomenon. But I won't spoil it for Joel, so
Yeah.
I won't get into that. But I think, like, what we're seeing happening right now, once again, can't help but tie it back in, is again a manifestation of that mistrust, where, you know, and then going back to my previous quote about language and how, you know, I'm very inclined, as, you know, a student of language in a sense, to see language as our superpower. But of course, it is true that language and um, uh, language, when misconstrued, has often caused a lot of conflict also throughout history, and it has led to things often becoming worse versus better, and fostering more of that distrust at times. So yeah, I think this is a quote that kind of resonates beyond the book and can be seen as relevant to any moment in history, including the present moment.
Have any of you read Nemesis?
I have not.
It's he wrote it a little. Well, actually, I guess he wrote it shortly before he wrote the sequels and prequels. So early in the 80s, I think.
Is it in the
And
same universe?
it's somewhat in the same universe. It's
Mm-hmm.
but it's set around the time that they develop superluminal flight, space flight beyond the speed of light, and it's a really interesting story. But I thought about this when listening to your episode when Priya was complaining about the female characters, because this one actually has the protagonist is a 15-year-old girl, and her mother is very, very important. In fact, they're the two of the most important characters in the story. And one of the things that's really interesting about their relationship is that she has kind of a superpower, the girl, in that she reads body language to an incredibly high level. So she knows when anyone is bullshitting her. And her mom hates it because she can't like manipulate her at all. You know, she always knows exactly what her mom is thinking based on her body language. So it's kind of an interesting explanation of a way of a mentalic capability that's rational. You know, it's just, oh, really good at reading body language, and that gives everything away. It's like a window into the soul, kind of, right?
You guys need to read Dune. You need to read about mentat computation. I can't even keep my mouth closed.
Yeah, I think I've heard about this, and I've read Dune a long, long, long time ago, and I don't know if I finished it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I have the
Oh yeah, I forgot. We're still going. The snake keeps moving.
yeah, the snake keeps moving. But I had the last pick, and I really wanted to pick this quote early on about with Lord Dorwin talking about like the Earth and everything, but I didn't want to do the accent, so I'm not going to do it.
I'll
So
do
I will
it.
but I will instead continue on my theme of antagonists. And I think the biggest antagonist relationships, and I think the best person who is the most antagonizing person is Eveling Miss and his relationship with Imber. especially because it's contrasted with Pritchard earlier, like being so reverent to Ember, and like, you know, now it's like in the course of the Foundation, like the mayors are basically like Emperor, the same as the Emperor, right? And you have to like not look at them or whatever. Like you have to be really regimented about how you interact with them. But Mist doesn't care about it at all. You know, like Talia mentioned earlier, he's a scientist. He's important. He doesn't need to have you know, his acceptance. He's the most important person, and the mayor be damned. So the one of the quotes that I picked was him interacting with Ember, and that says, "Exactly," said Miss dryly. When Seldon first established the Foundation, he was wise enough to include no psychologists among the scientists placed here, so that the Foundation has always worked blindly along the course of historical necessity. In the course of my researches, I have based a good deal upon the hints of the Time Vault. I'm aware of that, miss. It's a waste of time to repeat. I'm not repeating, blared Miss, because what I'm going to tell you isn't in any of the reports. What do you mean, not in the reports? Said Ember stupidly. How could Galaxy? Let me tell this my own way, you little offensive creature. Stop putting words in my mouth and questioning every statement, or I'll tramp out of here and let everything crumble around you. Remember, you unprintable fool, the Foundation will come through because it must. But if I walk out of here now, you won't. Again, I love antagonists, and like Miss is just the best, and his treatment of the mayor here is just this is great to read, and just his interaction. So it's too bad that we lost Miss too early, because it would have been great to see him continue on. But we got a lot of good story out of him.
I just realized there's an echo there with Seldon and Ling Chen from the Psychohistorians when Chen says, or when Seldon says that if you don't cooperate with me, you're going to be dead within a year.
Yeah.
It's kind of a similar kind of threat, right?
Yep.
I love how the overarching theme of Dan's quotes was the sass.
Yeah.
And I could always rely on you, Dan, to like kind of lighten the mood after I go with like some like very heavy topic.
Yeah. No, but that's a huge part of Asimov's charm too, is the sass and the comedy. He doesn't get enough credit for comedy, but he has some pretty funny moments.
Definitely. And I think like the series got only better. You know, like the first book is really interesting, and it's setting up the concepts, and it's more about like, it's more of like a thought exercise, you know. But then like when you get into the second and third books, it's really like he really dives into these characters and really fleshes them out, and like you really like understand them. Where in the earlier books, I think they kind of all blend together a little bit. But like the characters of Miss and the Mule and Arcady and Chan, it's like all these people, like they have like really defined in my mind of like, you know, how they seem. And I think that's just a testament to his writing getting better. And I think even in Foundation's Edge, I think the characters are really defined well there too. So I'm actually interested, now that we're done with the draft section, we're going to talk to Joel a little bit. And you had said that you had read the rest of the series. So like I mentioned, I really liked Foundation Edge, but I've heard mixed reviews of the other ones. So what's your impression of the other ones?
Well, I think the one you hear the most mixed review about is the last sequel, Foundation and Earth. And it is different in that it seems to drag on to a lot of people, and to me even it seemed to drag on in some aspects, but I think it's really interesting why. There's one protagonist, Golan Travis, who is kind of a butthead. He's not that pleasant a character, and he's the one you're supposed to relate to, right? And he has some very cringeworthy sexual experiences. That part I'm just warn you about up front.
Oh, really?
But he spends a lot of time bickering with this character Bliss, almost like a husband and wife bickering back and forth, and that's what a lot of people remember from it. But I've told you all the bad stuff. It also has an epic feel to it of an adventure through space and time, because the mission is to find Earth, and it's especially wonderful if you've read the Robot series. And I really recommend the Robot series, the 4 novels in the Robot series,
Yeah.
starting
Yeah, I
with
think
Caves
Priya,
of
you'd read
Steel.
those, right?
Yes, I did read I Robot, and I read it a long time ago,
Oh,
so I don't remember.
not iRobot.
Oh, okay.
After iRobot, because iRobot's basically a lot of short stories compiled into
Yes.
something like a novel. But these are 4 robot stories I'm talking about. Start with one called The Caves of Steel, and they have 2 main protagonists, one human and one robot, and they're set up as a Sherlock Holmes style story set in the far distant future. Asimov loved mystery, and he, obviously, as we can see, the Second Foundation's all about mystery and everything.
Mm.
But this is a very classic, like Sherlock Holmesy style stories. And there's the Caves of Steel, and then the next one is it goes off planet. The Caves of Steel is on Earth, and then the next one is on this spacer world, where humans have gone into a different populated other worlds, and one of them is called Solaria, and it's just an amazing place. And then the next one's a planet called Aurora, and then finally they go back, and the Robots and Empire is the last one, and it's kind of in several places. But the main 2 planets, Aurora and Solaria, feature in Foundation and Earth. So it's this wonderful progression through the galaxy, looking for Earth, and they stumble upon these worlds that you remember if you've read the Robot series, but
Mm.
they're 30,000 years later. So
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah.
they're just like ruins of those places, and absolutely fascinating. That's what really captured my attention. So I loved it. I loved ultimately loved it, knowing that there's things that aren't so fun in them, that are
Yeah.
kind of annoying. But
How about the
then
prequels? Yeah.
the prequels take you back to fleshing out who was Hari Seldon.
Mm.
And it starts with him as like he's in his 20s, I guess, at the beginning. And it's the only time you meet Cleon. It's kind of this is where some of the things in the show come from, but they're very much modified in the show. And there's only one Cleon, not 3 of them. No genetic dynasty and all that stuff. And there is a character called Demerzel, and I can't spoil it by telling you much about Demerzel, because there's a lot of revelations that happen with Demerzel. But the 2 stories are really fascinating because they travel all over Trantor, and they get into the different sectors of Trantor and the different kind of microcultures and things that are happening there. So it's really fun. Um, I was just listening. Do you guys listen to Star's End podcast?
I'd listened to like the first episode, but like they was like in the middle of me reading, and they got a little spoilery, so I was like, I'll wait.
Yeah. They did a season where they covered the trilogy as the
Mm.
books, and then they did their second season was all about the show, and now they're going back and doing the prequels. But what I found interesting is they're really like picking apart the prequels, as like finding all the things that don't make sense and stuff. And I didn't read them that way, and I just loved them. I just found them really fun and interesting stories. It gets the last one gets really sad though, because Hari Seldon gets very close to the end, and it's also when Asimov himself was very close to the end.
Yeah,
And
because it
you
was
can
published
feel it.
posthumously, right?
I believe the last, he didn't quite finish, and I think the last section was helped out by his wife. She was a science fiction writer too. He might have written it all, but it kind of ends in a little bit of a, I don't know, it's not very satisfying. But the main feeling I got from it is this is the story a guy who's dying himself is writing about a guy who's dying.
Interesting.
And it's compelling, but definitely sad.
So of the series, do you have like a favorite book or like a favorite part?
Oh, I loved Foundation's Edge.
Yeah.
I love the trilogy, of course. Out of the four post, I'd say my favorite of the whole series is probably Foundation and Empire,
Yeah.
with the mule.
Yeah, that was my answer too. Like it's
Yeah,
kind of cheating. Like the mule section spans the two books.
yeah. But yeah, there's still parts of all the books that really resonate with me and just make me, I just love them. And there's a great the way Foundation and Edge ends is so electric. It just
Yeah.
is a
Yeah, I
whole.
was telling Thalia and Priya that you should read that. It's yeah, I just like read it in like a week and it was really good. Like especially at the end, how I like the tension really ramps up and like you don't know what's gonna happen.
Is that the very next book
Yeah,
after this? Okay. I might
yeah,
read it.
yeah. A couple of questions about your podcast actually. I found it it's sort of in the middle of us recording this one, and it kind of lined up exactly where we were. I don't remember. I think I saw your post on Reddit or something, and you had mentioned it, and so I checked it out, and I listened all the way up, all the story episodes that I read up to, and then I continued listening to all the story episodes after I finished. So I was wondering, like, did you have like any inspirations for other like that your style of podcast? Because it's pretty interesting how you do like dramatic readings and analysis.
Yeah, and
Um,
I would have to say I discovered it as I was doing that. I didn't really plan that out.
hmm,
The biggest inspiration is reading the whole series, but
hmm,
the in particular, I wrote a Reddit post, and I just put this on my blog, seldoncrisis.net, a repost of it about a few months before I started the podcast. It was a recap, basically, of the mayors, and I said I think the title was "Is the Mayors the Greatest Story in Foundation?" And later I'd say no, but it's the one that was on my mind right after reading it, and it was like I was just really uh, into it. But I basically wrote the whole post was basically a recap of the mayors, and I just enjoyed writing that so much
hmm.
that I want to do this for every section. And then what do I do with it? Maybe I should make a podcast out of it. And I originally intended to only do story episodes, but then I had after the very first episode, when I think only the trailer had been released, not even the first episode, when I got contacted by the guy, the Nathaniel Goldberg, who did he's the philosophy prof.
Hmm.
And so I made that a guest episode. And then I had this kind of a crisis about after the first season, when I finished the first book and getting into the second one, because I had set we were talking earlier about the cadence, right? And I've been told, yeah, you shouldn't change your cadence. If you're going to do one every 2 weeks, you should do every episode 2 weeks apart, right? And that was easy for the first one because I wrote the first 5 scripts before I recorded any of them. So there wasn't much work to do beyond just recording. And I would, once I had the whole first season written, but I got to the end of the first season going into the second one, and I didn't have any scripts written out in advance. And I found out that's what takes the longest, is
Hmm.
trying to write those scripts. And I found it was impossible to do that in 2 weeks. So I had to it took me a month to get the second one. Then I was like, oh, what do I do? Well, I decided I'm going to make them a month apart. And I just felt like, oh, but my listeners are waiting eagerly to hear, I'm thinking, inflating my importance, that they have to, they're going to want to hear something. So I started doing essays and and guest episodes and things to fill in that intermediate 2 weeks. And now I love that part too. I've really enjoyed doing the essays.
It certainly doesn't come across that way. I mean, um, as disjointed, like as someone who listens to some of the non-story episodes on purpose, they do seem to blend pretty seamlessly into the larger project because you're not as bound by plot. You're telling more dramatically an experience with this series and with this author. So obviously we can't relate to your cadence issues because we've never missed a date and we're always very rigorous.
Right. 6 weeks after we released our last episode. Or more.
But that's really good to get some insight into.
Well, the funny thing
Seldon
is,
Crisis.
most people don't experience podcasts, the way a podcaster does. They don't do it, time based the same way. Most people like discover a podcast and then go back and binge it. Right.
Right.
So it doesn't really matter that much what your cadence was for those people. Right.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
I also have to say that when listening to your more storytelling based ones, I feel like I just kept thinking, I was like, oh, like Joel should read more. He should be like the narrator for like audiobooks on Audible because I would read more because I'm actually very like picky about the narrator of a audiobook, like the reader, I should say, the reader. And like if the reader is bad, like I can't listen to the audiobook, then I just have to read it myself. So I kept thinking like, oh, like you'd be like an excellent reader for like a variety of different books. So it's kind of like calming to listen to those storytelling ones where you can just kind of relax and like put on the episode and sort of like, kind of immerse yourself into it.
Cool.
So I do really like and enjoy that format, and I think you pull it off really well.
Oh, well, thanks. One thing I was going to say about having discovered it as I did it is that I knew I needed to have quotes in there. I needed, because the quotes are what it's all about, right? The dialogue is what it's all about. And I just couldn't read them plainly as like in one voice. I found myself like having to read Hari Seldon different from Ling Chen, when I featured those quotes. And basically I found like I discovered that I'm a ham, and I like acting, and so that became the thing that really drove me for a while. It's just how can this character sound? What can I do? And it's all about just empathizing with them and like trying to figure out where they're coming from, what's in their head, and that kind of defines their voice.
It's like a really powerful tool because I remember when I listened to the audiobook of the recent Andy Weir book, Project Hail Mary. The reader does that book he voice acts that book basically, and it has so much more of an impact when it's done that way. So that is definitely very enjoyable.
Well, I wanted to ask about what you said just now, Joel, that the dialogue is what it's really about, and that's why you choose to include quotes. I have seen a few people who have the opinion that Asimov really only shines in his works that are not too dependent on characters having a lot of dialogue, because that's what a lot of his short stories are about. And I was curious to hear your take on whether someone can be an Asimov fan without having, read or having any kind of a relationship with this series, in particular with the Foundation.
I don't know. It's just you either. I think why he's so into dialogue is because of his love for mystery, and like that. If you think about Sherlock Holmes or something, there's a lot of dialogue. It's all revealed in dialogue. The clues are revealed there, and it's how he frames a story. And so if you love that kind of story, then you're going to love Asimov. And especially if you have an imagination that wants to contemplate thousands of years in the future and, the whole span of the galaxy and things like that. And so
Joel was asking a bit earlier about our favorite episodes of the podcast. And I would say my favorite part of your show was when you did the story of, or the part when the mule takes over the Foundation, and like you can really feel the tension, and like I think you had like music behind it, and like it was just like a really a really good way to tell that story and to like really build up that tension. I really like that part.
Well, I have to give a shout out to my son Jeremy, who is a whiz with sound editing, and he the first five stories in the season 1, I didn't include him. I just did it all myself. And starting with the general, I realized I really need some sound design. I really could have used some sound design in like especially in the Merchant Princes for that the trial scene, and all that stuff. And I felt like it really was missing that. And I pulled him in, and he loved it, and he did really good work. And that was one of the things that he really got into, was doing the fall of the foundation and setting up all that. He says that he screwed it up, and he could have done a much better job because he's still learning what he was doing.
A true artist.
Yeah. He's more of he's a video editor, and he's doing really good work as a video editor now. He's almost like out of I can't afford him anymore.
That's great.
Especially, I don't pay him anything, and it's like, no, I can't do that, Dad. I have work to do. He's delayed episodes because I will wait until he's available before I'll finish an episode.
You said you read the entire series. How did you like the entire series? Is he like an Asimov fan now?
Oh, absolutely. He just he ate it up, and that was wonderful to see, and share. That's a great bonding experience to both read Foundation together.
Yeah, that's
and be able to talk about it. We still talk about it, and just, I talked to him about this episode and what quotes I had selected, and we had a nice conversation about that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Okay. Well, we're about an hour and a half in, and it's late on the East Coast, so I will let you guys go. But thank you very much, Joel, for joining us. Really appreciate your insights. And again, recommend all of our listeners to listen to Seldon Crisis podcast. Really great listen. And we'll be talking to everyone again soon, hopefully about our next project. Like I said before, we are still deciding what we're going to be doing, but we will be in contact.
Okay.
But Joel, thank you very much for joining us. It was great to have you on.
I'm so happy that you invited me on. It was a lot of fun.
Aw, thanks, Joel.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Okay, well, please check out rehydrate.space for all of our episodes, reading lists, and all the other stuff we put on there. And if you want to contact us, please email us at rehydrate@fastmail.com or on Twitter @rehydratepod. Thanks.